continuing forward, and just to kind of elaborate on what I confused myself with the last time, where I said that um, obviously the Supremacy Clause deals with the supremacy of federal law over state law when it is constitutional. But I showed you these things, and I was kind of using saying the Constitution is the law of the land. Therefore, by extension, federal laws are, and so are treaties. I messed up the treaties part, but in summary, what we have seen in power disputes between the national and state governments, often using the supremacy clause as the argument, although it's certainly not the only one, we often see the federal government wins. Not always, but often, right? And we've seen it a lot recently with the Affordable Care Act, which was a federal mandate that states sued the federal government and said, by what right do you have um, to like require citizens to buy health insurance? Um, and the federal government won that case, right? And that they argued that it's because we have the right to tax, and so we're not requiring people to buy insurance, but we are saying that if you don't, we're going to tax the heck out of you. And so the federal government won that argument, and the court said, yes, we buy it. The federal government is within the bounds of the Constitution. Therefore, states, you're losing this one, right? Federal government wins. We've also seen it in No Child Left Behind. Now, moving on to the next question is, what historical moments, as we think about the DNA of our country and like things that have happened over the last 150 years, what historical moments have affected federal supremacy? Because when the Constitution began, you can tell that the founders made a really concerted effort to speak to states' worries of an overly dominant federal government. And so they straight up put in the Constitution all sorts of safeguards that protected state powers. Um, but as our country has progressed, I'm giving you the snapshot here, as our country has progressed, clearly the federal government has gotten more powerful over the states. And so, what were those historical moments that led to the growth in federal power? And so, number one, we started to see we saw this trend straight out the gates, right? Like with McCulloch v. Maryland and Gibbons v. Ogden and things like that we're going to look at over the next couple of days, which were in the early days of the country. But we also saw a great extension of federal power around the time of the Civil War, where quite simply the federal government flexed its power with the Union over state sovereignty by basically saying, states, you're not allowed to have slavery, and we're going to force you to do that, right? And we're going to force you to get rid of that. And the states fought a war over it, and the federal government obviously won, the Union won. We also saw a pretty huge extension of federal power in the civil rights era, right? Where basically certain states, Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, etc., certain states were very clearly, in the Jim Crow South, were really very clearly trampling all over the rights and civil liberties um, of African American people. And so, we saw the federal government come in and mandate desegregation in schools in Brown v. Board of Education. We saw them come in and pass the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act that basically had a hard check on state power and said, states, you can't be trusted with this stuff because you're using your state powers to deprive civilians and citizens of their rights, and so we're not going to allow it. And so the civil rights era greatly enhanced federal power over the states, right? And Brown v. Board of Education was the Supreme Court case. It's one of our mandatory Supreme Court cases, but at its heart, it was a federalism case, right? Where the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, was not allowing African American children to go to school with white children, and the government came in and said, "Hey, the 14th Amendment says." That everyone is equal under the law, and so you can't do that. That separate but equal is not equal. Um, and so they sued, and the state argued that the federal government didn't have the right to tell them what to do with regards to their Kansas schools. And the federal government said, actually, we do. And who won? Federal government, right? And suddenly, um, Topeka, Kansas had to integrate their schools, and Plessy v. Ferguson was overturned. And I'm saying these cases like you know them, partially because I think you some of them you do, right? They were U.S. history cases in APUSH last year. Um, but maybe the most important federalism amendment in the Constitution, one of the most important federalism amendments in the entire Constitution, along with the 14th Amendment, is the 10th Amendment. It is the last amendment in the Bill of Rights. We know the Bill of Rights is amendments number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And the 10th Amendment is the amendment that was given to appease anti-federalists, that basically protected a lot of states' rights. And so you have to know the 10th Amendment. It is all over the AP exam at the end of the year. And the 10th Amendment is a massive federalism amendment because what it says quite clearly, and I'll just read you the words and then I'll talk about them, is that powers not deleted or not wait, that should be delegated. Powers not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution, meaning powers that weren't expressly given to the federal government by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, meaning powers not expressly given to the federal government by the Constitution, and also not expressly prohibited to the states, are reserved to the states respectively. So what does that mean, right? That's legal language. But basically it means that if the Constitution doesn't specifically say that the federal government can do something, and it also doesn't specifically say that states can't do something, then states can do it, right? And so the 10th Amendment is oftentimes used by states to argue, hey, you know, you're trying to tell us we can't do something right now, but the Constitution doesn't say we can't, and it doesn't also say that it's your responsibility. So therefore, the 10th Amendment allows us to do it, right? And essentially, what the 10th Amendment does is it defines the boundary of federal power. Basically, anything that is not specifically given to the federal government nor specifically prohibited to the states is the domain of the states, right? So that encompasses a lot of things, and I'm trying to think off the top of my head, and obviously I've been pretty poor at this tonight at finding examples, but there's thousands of examples of powers that state governments have specifically because the 10th Amendment allows them to have that power, right? We already said that the Constitution is only 17 pages long, right? And so in those 17 pages, you're not going to cover all the different laws and powers that exist, but basically states have all sorts of powers because they're not specifically given to the federal government in the Constitution, and they're not specifically denied to the states in the Constitution. And so as long as it doesn't fall on those two things, the 10th Amendment says quite clearly that power belongs to the states. And so maybe I'll put the ball in your court since I'm having a trouble finding a good example. Um, the last question tonight that you're going to have to answer, or maybe the second to last one, is going to be to do a quick little Google search of a good example of the 10th Amendment, and then write that in your homework for the lecture, right? To show me a power that states have specifically because the 10th Amendment exists. And so, we have seen the 10th Amendment, as we've seen all amendments and all federal laws and parts of the Constitution. We've seen the Supreme Court have to clarify this, like exactly what the limit is, right? Because there are limits to the 10th Amendment, just like there's limits to the Second Amendment and limits to the First Amendment, right? We have freedom of speech, but we don't have a limited freedom of speech. And so the Supreme Court cases have come along over the years, many of them, that have clarified that state power doesn't supersede federal, and that the 10th Amendment really only allows states to do something so long as it checks those two boxes, meaning it's not prohibited to the states and it's not expressly given to the federal government. And so again, you're going to look on Google and find a better example to help you understand. Now, the 11th Amendment is I'm not going to speak too much on it because it never shows up in the exam, and it's a pretty minor amendment in the grand scheme of things, but it's a federalism amendment, and it does affect federal supremacy because the 11th Amendment basically says that states can't be sued by citizens in federal court. So, I can't file suit against the state of Colorado in federal court, so it's a protection against state power. Um, I'm going to skip over it. I want you to focus on the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment is the Federalism Amendment, along with the 14th. Um, so the last 4 minutes or 4.5 minutes of today, we're going to go into the significance of McCulloch v. Maryland. And this is a part of the lecture that I probably will revisit on Friday during class tomorrow. We're going to begin looking at a project that I'm going to assign you that's going to be exploring federalism cases, and you're going to need to kind of write the background of the case and tell me what the impact on federal power of the case was. Did it increase federal power or did it limit federal power? But the big one that starts, and it's going to be our example one, is McCulloch v. Maryland, right? It's in the early days of the United States. It is a Supreme Court case of great significance, and let's talk about it because it is clearly a federalism case. Um, it happened in 1819, which is just about 25 or about 30 years after the ratification of the Constitution. And essentially, the question that was being examined here, that the question in front of the court was, could the federal government create a national bank even though the Constitution doesn't specifically give them that power, right? And the story of it is that the federal government created a national bank in Baltimore, Maryland, right? And they basically started this bank, and the state of Maryland said, "Hey, wait a second, we don't think you can do that. Um, so we're going to tax you, right? We're going to tax this national bank. We're A, going to sue you and say we don't think you can actually do that, but B, we're also going to tax that bank, right? And the federal government said, well, we're not going to pay your tax, Maryland. You're just a stupid state. We're the federal government. And so that question went to court, right? Could the federal government even create a national bank in the first place? And so this was a hard question because, again, there's nowhere in the Constitution that says the federal government can create banks, right? But the federal government argued, it says, yeah, okay, we concede. You're right. There's nothing in the Constitution that says we can do that. But there is a part of the Constitution that says something about how the federal government can do all things necessary and proper in order to accomplish its constitutional mandates. And so the Constitution does clearly say that the federal government is charged with regulating the economy, right? And so if the federal government is charged by the Constitution of regulating the economy, then the federal government's arguing that says, hey, um, we're supposed to regulate the economy, and clearly it says that we can do all things necessary in order to do that. And so that was the federal argument, right? That Congress can use all means necessary and proper, and this is a direct quote from the Constitution, that they can use all things means necessary and proper in order to fulfill their responsibilities, right? And so that becomes an incredibly powerful argument because suddenly states go, oh crap, that line does say that they can do all things necessary and proper in order to do what the Constitution tells them to do. And so if you are put on your lawyer hats for a second, if I tell you that you can do all things necessary in order to accomplish a goal of yours, then basically I'm giving you free rein to do damn near whatever you want as long as you can make an argument that you're doing it in order to accomplish what I told you to do, right? And so that was the federal defense. And Chief Justice John Marshall, writing for the majority in the court, said, we buy your defense. The Constitution is very short, right? We believe that the federal government has more powers than simply what the Constitution specifically says, right? That the enumerated powers of the Constitution are not the only powers they have. There is something called implied powers, right? And so, A, we have the supremacy clause as a result of McCulloch v. Maryland. But B, we also see from the, I'm not focusing on here, I think it's on the next slide, but we're not going to have time for, that basically there's this whole range of powers the federal government has that are implied